In 2010, a Blacktown artist, Johann Neve, won the Blacktown Art Prize with his work When I Said I Came from Mount Druitt, She Said She Couldn't Love Me. This is not an artist, people, to have a failed relationship with. You know, you too could end up in the Blacktown Art Prize, and worse than that, the painting actually hangs outside the planning discussion rooms at Blacktown Council to remind you of this situation. I think that the thing about Johann's work is it's part of an intense creative discourse about place and social diversity that shaped the creative life of the outer suburbs of Sydney over the last 40 years, and it's been a particular 40 years, I think. It could be argued that Western Sydney has been the workshop in which new diversities are endlessly trialled. The consolidation of poverty, entry-level migrant cultures, older working class suburbs, repurposed, new release suburbs, aspirational suburbia, peri-urban farming, landscapes of abuse and redress. And much of what has happened despite planning. When we look now at the master plans that were developed way back then for places like Minto and Bidwell, and they were very beautiful master plans with a high level of social conscience about the future of those communities. Who could have predicted that it would just end so badly? And on the other hand, you know, if we asked Urban Growth now, in planning Bungarraby, did they set out to plan the suburb for its current lively Indian population? Maybe we wouldn't get an answer on that as well. Or is cultural diversity, be it insurgent or aspirational, in fact the most opportunistic of city outcomes? Restless, unpredictable, surprising. In this presentation, I want to consider the cultural products and discourse that have accompanied this, the interruptions and affirmations that have insisted on a textured understanding of the suburban landscape as diverse, with its layered histories and complicated contemporary narratives. Now, during the 80s, the new suburbs of outer Western Sydney began to have a highly place-specific process of cultural production. This was a time of transition from inner Sydney to Western Sydney, a migration that is now largely replaced by people moving across the region. People who had known intimately the urban landscapes of Redfern, Waterloo and Leichhardt found themselves in the new suburban landscapes of Tregear, Cartwright and Macquarie Fields. The move and the process of settlement represented a process of dispossession and acclimatisation to what was for them an unrecognisable cultural landscape. During this time, increasing criticism of areas such as Mount Druitt and Green Valley in Sydney resulted in cultural projects aimed at providing residents with the opportunity to recontextualise or reenact the suburban landscape. Now, at this time, Garage Graphics, a community workshop, was set up in Emerton, Mount Druitt, and this was in the late 70s. It was in the garage of opera singer Peter Dawson's previous family home, Rutherglen, which was now deep in suburbia. I keep saying suburbia because we're doing an artwork by Regina Walter called Suburbia, where she's done this beautiful tree and there are birdhouses in it that are like McMansions. And it's ruined me forever on suburbia. Okay, so at the end of 1986, the garage had been operating for about 7 years and it was an established part of the community infrastructure of Mount Druitt. The Community Arts Project Mount Druitt 365 Days was produced at the end of that year, and it gives an insight, I think, into the issues and imagery in the process of self-definition. The cover image, in the cover image, I think the reality of women's lives in an area that had one of the largest groupings of single mothers in Australia's social history found purchase in an image of women in the suburban landscape pushing a stroller through the essentially masculine territories of the sports field. In the background, boys are grouped as if for a team photo. They relinquish their position as the subject. And I think here the notion of suburbia as the terrain of the nuclear family began to fray as new household structures gained critical mass. I find this incredibly evocative. There never seemed to be a footpath in the right place in those days. There never seemed to be a destination like a good playground. It's hard to underestimate how bad the planning was for those people who survived that time. Local commentaries extend to relationships with the then Housing Commission, and increasingly I think criticism of planning itself emerged as a subject. The December page, Mount Druitt wasn't planned for people, but people are changing that, expressed a common theme. And I mean, this was a new, I suppose, a hopeful positive change that started to emerge. In the poster, We Won in Toongabbie, the reality of resident dissent leading to planning outcomes is in evidence. This is the emergence of urban renewal, a process that has gathered traction in major cities across the world. A recognition of the link between cultural diversity, both good and bad planning outcomes. A discourse that says, in effect, this urban plan may have worked for you, but we are different and it's not working for us. I think we need to remind ourselves that the part that residents have played over the years in the big planning revolutions of the last 50 years. Within the new demographics of Western Sydney, particular narratives about the reality of social diversities began to emerge. The suburbanisation of Aboriginal communities gathered momentum during this time, with suburbs such as Bidwell and Bonnyrigg having at times larger Indigenous populations than rural areas. This was a time when Aboriginal people began to make sense of the notion of a suburban identity. This was new language that began to describe the subjects of significance, not just deaths in custody and the stolen generation, as important as they are, but also the displacement evident in the journey from country to the inner city and then out to the suburbs. This is Gary Jones's work, Urban Koori Views, and it's fabric printing. I think also important was the consolidation of new ethnic diversities. Now, the arbitrary spatial arrangement of ethnicity had by the late 90s resulted in quite distinctive local environments. The proximity to Villawood Migrant Hostel had a clear influence on the movement of newly arrived Vietnamese refugees in the 70s to hubs like Cabramatta, and the dispersal of land packages owned by Landcom shaped the cultural industries hub of Bonnyrigg. Large bits of land were allocated to one ethnic group after another in Bonnyrigg, and you saw the Lao Wat, the Turkish mosque, just rolling on down along Bonnyrigg Creek. Diverse religious organisations obtained land and they built an impressive range of temples. And while the intention was to service religious diversity within the suburban environment of Fairfield, the impact of the buildings on the urban landscape, the calendar of festival events and the sense of inclusiveness that such organisations such as the Lao Wat depicted here promote resulted in increasingly well-visited cultural destinations. I've focused on visual arts here, but a similar foci were evident in community theatre. This is Deaf Defying Theatre performing at the now demolished Villawood housing estate. The process here was in essence a reenacting of the dramas of everyday suburban life, an engaging process, I think, for both performers and spectators. The Bidwell riots, this is the paper thing that I've got from my archive, the billboard from the Daily Telegraph from the day of the Bidwell riots in 1981. They were very overblown by the media, but they did set a very strong agenda. Riots set a very strong agenda in a community. And after the riots, I think what happened was that the patterns of both insurgency and aspiration became much more defined in the outer suburbs. Dissident urban agendas were forming and new identities and practices that disturb established histories were becoming recognisable. By contrast, and I think this is important, in other localities, suburbs that by the end of the millennium were described as aspirational, the pleasures of suburban life were being articulated with a new confidence. And this is another fabric printing project with Jan Mackay, 1989, House and Garden. It used the cultural mapping technique to document gardens, homemade garden ornaments, pets' houses and families enjoying the domestic environment. This was a new notion, the notion that suburbia may be, I think I've sort of got a sort of Tourette's really with this, might be culturally dense, satisfying, socially satisfying, even amusing emerged. And there was also a belief that social relationships could drive cultural identity even in the absence of appropriate planning, which I think is an important thing for us to think about. At this time, smaller land releases in Mount Druitt, such as Hebersham, came online. First home buyers began to define their aspirations, and in the early 90s, the value of cultural planning as a component of new development areas became evident, with Elders commissioning a cultural plan for Glenmore Park in 1991, which Linda Corkery and a number of other people worked with me on. I think the other thing, though, that happened in the 90s was that there was a new methodology of urban dissent and redress that developed. This is Liverpool Council's Living Streets project, and interestingly, they've rolled this project on, and if you look at their website, you see now a mainstreamed process of creative intervention in very poor communities. But this first one, Speed Street neighbourhood, a mix of red brick walk-ups, old housing along the railway line, populated by very poor private tenants, new and illegal migrants, displaced people, others on the fringe. The project at that point was community motivated. There were amazing scenes. I mean, it was the start, I think, of the community garden movement, and people had established really, illegal, in inverted commas, community gardens along the Georges River that were going incredibly well, and then they moved into an area that council had set aside, and it was totally self-driven. I mean, there wasn't a coordinator from the Botanic Gardens or whoever managing these gardens, and they were often people who had been farmers in their own countries, in the Middle East and other places, and they took to gardening with a relish and worked very well. I mean, it was also interesting. I can remember when when particular political situations blew up around the world, the gardeners were incredibly diverse, and they talked through how they would react, because they all came from opposing sides of whatever situation it was. They were terrific people, and it was a powerful project which still continues. But I think the other thing to understand about this is that I don't think it would have been possible, the Living Streets project wouldn't have been possible without the community buy-in that was determined by the engagement of radical media workers, who some of whom were Kurdish refugees themselves. And I think that this was part of Western Sydney starting to have, highly skilled and often quite radical cultural workers who could work with communities with a depth that previously hadn't been seen before. It's reasonable to say that in the 90s, in the outer suburbs, there was a coming of age of a new generation of creatives and the beginning of a more nuanced process of planning and design. Centres like Parramatta started to have the big city dialogues. The creatives were the children of outer suburbia. Intercultural, educated in places like UWS Creative Arts, they were encouraged to express their urban tendencies. And it was possible by 2000 to shortlist for the podium screen of Bates Smart's design for New Police HQ here, from Western Sydney artists, with Regina Walter, a graduate of UWS and a self-described child of the Polish post-war diaspora in Fairfield, winning that commission. These new creatives were very easy with the icons of suburban life. At this time, I think the consolidation of migrant communities in Western Sydney was paralleled by a more textured intercultural approach to community art projects, many of which continued to address issues of place and identity. I'm always reminded of Kung Lee's focus on beef fur and his project that involved the whole of the restaurant scene in Cabramatta, to the extent, Louise will recall this, to the extent that even his friends said, "Oh, for God's sake, Kung, it's just soup." But I think the other thing that happened at this time was a rise of cultural infrastructure. The Casula Powerhouse, Campbelltown Arts Centre, Blacktown Arts Centre and Penrith Regional Gallery. And they enabled detailed explorations of cultural identity, emerging populations and new creative forms. It was a different gallery scene. It was very engaged, it enabled artists, and importantly it provided a context for different cultures to explore. I think a lot of the work they did was very risky. I can remember the project Remembering Anita, which was about the Anita Cobby murder. I mean, when I heard about the development of that, I just couldn't imagine how you could do that, how you could pull that off. But it was an interesting and very detailed project with many different perspectives that actually navigated that critical territory. In this decade, I think decisive change began in some of the most ethnically diverse neighbourhoods of the West, with I've mentioned the planning demolition of Villawood housing estate in 1996. Early planning for what would become New Leaf Bonnyrigg and the planned redevelopment of Minto public housing. I think of the many perspectives on this time, two things are interesting. Renewal was increasingly seen and managed as a cultural process in terms of consultation and outcome. And there was also an alternative discourse emerging about renewal itself. Big Pinko, an ephemeral work where a soon to be demolished house was painted hot pink in Minto, brought the ubiquitous Department of Housing townhouse into focus. There was a level of nostalgia, even dissonance, that was evident. In Leaving Minto, that was evident in Leaving Minto, the oral history. And part of this was the notion that poverty, and poverty I think has been the big diversity in Sydney that positions Western Sydney against the rest of Sydney. There was the notion that poverty is not a single discourse or a monotonal experience, but a textured reality that includes substantial successes and emotional landscapes of memory, pain and regret. It can't be ignored, however, that the breakup and subsequent renewal of Radburn estates like Minto and Bonnyrigg enabled excellence in design, especially in landscape design, on a scale that hadn't been seen in the outer suburbs before. Well-designed open space with a focus on people gathering, play, connecting with natural environments, safe walkability, easily attractive demarcations of public and private space have distinguished this. And the very detailed community engagement processes consistently referenced cultural projects as part of a functional public domain, and more importantly, as part of the expression of community values and the notion of a common experience and social diversity. One of the things that happened a lot, and this is part of the redesign of Aids, was that we used to busload residents to other places to look at what was good. We encouraged them to bring their children, we encouraged them to test drive other suburbs that had good open space, and it was a very successful process. I mean, it happened over a period of years and it was done in a number of those big areas. And it was, I can remember just talking about the diversity of the residents. I can remember once taking a group of residents to a great park in Fairfield, Barina, I think, and they rushed out, and the mums all just leapt on the equipment, and I thought, oh, you kids are so young, like it was amazing just seeing that desire for play among these very young parents. As community renewal gathered momentum, so did the redevelopment or the development of the major new estates or sites in Western Sydney. So at this time, Ropes Crossing, the Ponds, Bungarraby, Potts Hill and others came online. And interestingly, these suburbs were more culturally diverse than anticipated as specific ethnicities gained traction in the private housing market. In 2011, 40% of the population of the Ponds spoke a language other than English at home, compared to 36% for Blacktown as a whole and 22% for New South Wales. Now, the Ponds is seen as one of the most advantaged suburbs in Sydney, and it's you know, and I mean, I always feel a bit nervous talking about demographics. I can always hear Bill Randolph snuffling in the undergrowth when I bring it up. But, you know, I think that we continually underestimate the movement of the aspirational ethnicities in Western Sydney into these big new housing areas. What has emerged is the aspirational yet culturally diverse suburb, and interesting permeations of family housing, which I hope that Hugo will develop, emerged as residents sorted intergenerational living. I mean, yes, they lived in a McMansion, but they had 3 generations of the same family living there. You know, be careful what you assume. Grandparents and preschoolers populated weekday open space where previously everybody had been going to work. I mean, there were new ways of living in these areas. A planned and well-designed public domain was prioritised and delivered early in the process. And I think that one of the things about that was that it enabled, you know, excellence in landscape design that worked well for those suburbs, but it also worked well for surrounding areas because it was cashed up by the private housing market. And I mean, this has been an interesting feature, I think, of those areas, especially in traditionally very poor areas like Blacktown, where it has been very hard for councils to deliver that kind of open space. And it certainly creates its challenges. I think parallel to the ethnically diverse communities in new suburbs in Blacktown, other diversities were being given expression by the development process itself and the funding available for the public domain. The direct connection to the landscapes of Blacktown, in particular the creek lines through Blacktown, was articulated by this changed environment. Now, the archaeological work along Second Ponds Creek by local Aboriginal groups and archaeologist Joe McDonald unearthed 15,000 objects just in the dig sites, which, as you know, if you've worked in that area, quite small. I mean, in effect, Second Ponds Creek was the Durrig kitchen. Durrig artist and elder Auntie Edna Watson had for some years explored the patterns of the imagined Durrig campsite in her work, and in 2007 we began work with her and project artist Graham Chalcroft and Clouston landscape architects to create the campsite as part of the newly regenerated Ponds Parklands. This is it from the air. Auntie Edna working with Graham on some of the sculptural work. The integrated artwork creates a creative play environment in which children can play as Aboriginal children would have played pre-settlement. It's a robust and active space in which children drag sticks into the gunya, fill bowls with leaves. It just drives maintenance people crazy. Set up camp, and it's designed to be a place of learning where bush tucker and cultural workshops can be held by the Durrig. This is Chris Tobin running a workshop there on site. Gathering is one of a series of artworks along the Ponds Parkland that enable an understanding of other narratives along the Creek Line and Cycleway, and which is now the route to Rouse Hill Town Centre and, in time, the North West Rail link. The link between heritage, landscape, built form and art and the expression of a complicated Aboriginal past was also enabled at Bungarraby, another new area on the edge of Western Sydney parklands. The landscape design by Clouston frees the view from the site of the Bungarraby homestead to the creek and across the countryside, but it's also an ascendant view. The Durrig would have looked up from the creek at the site of European settlement, the site of dispossession, and as Aboriginal workers became engaged in stock work and domestic duties, like by the 1860s, Aboriginal people were working on all these big estates as stockmen and domestic servants. It was the view of the boss's house. Edna and Leanne Watson with Jane Kavanagh wanted to work with the trees along the creek line, the casuarinas, which is a significant tree for the Durrugs, but they also wanted to explore the way a mob of kangaroos might encroach on the house, as the Durrug must have done in those days. Durrug culture also found expression in the Community Resource Hub, a straw bale building designed by Rod Simpson. We worked with Rod to understand the capacity of the architecture to integrate art, and then engage Durrug textile designer Robin Coghlan to work with the skin of the building in her work, Patterns of Place. Now, in emphasising the Aboriginal narrative, I'm not discounting the direct art involvement by new residents in the selection of artists, the community process of art making. This project, Jockey Colours, picked up on the horse racing history using an age-appropriate use of colour and form. These are some of the little people that worked in the workshops, and it's the freeze around the children's room. But I mean, rather I'm suggesting that just as an ephemeral work explores new dialogues, so too can permanent art in new landscapes explore different cultural realities. New environments, especially well-designed environments, can offer targeted opportunities for diverse groups to engage directly in cultural production in a way that is often far more ambitious than they might have otherwise have done. As part of the art delivery at the Ponds, we established a partnership with the Metal Workshop at Parklea Prison, which borders the western edge of the suburb. It had a social justice focus with the objective of having an artist work with the prisoners on a seating design which they would then fabricate for install in the public domain. And seating designer Russell Anderson worked with the men over a year to develop their design work and oversee fabrication. The project was successful not only in the product, which is beautiful and robust, but the pride the men took in the creative process, and also the opportunity to create a bespoke product for a local environment. The men were competent metal workers, and I tell you what, I think that was a factor in some of them being there. Our best bloke was a shipbuilder, and I think he'd customised some ships in some way. But their work was fantastic, and they went on to really mass produce the seating pods. They are actually going to fabricate the bird houses for Regina's work, Suburbia, and I understand they're doing other projects as well. So it's had an ongoing impact for them. In Potts Hill, the redevelopment of the major water infrastructure site in Sydney, cultural engagement has included schools on the Cooper Road threshold of the new urban area. Artist Marion Abood worked with Karingal School to develop Digital Rain, a graphic art project in which students with severe behavioural issues worked with Marion and Nine Lives Parkour Group on physical actions such as water drumming to develop imagery. They were so naughty. Marion has 3 boys, and I mean, I'd never say this to her, but now it's on YouTube. I just thought, I need an artist like you. And I said to her, oh, and so how are you going with the lads? And she said, oh, they're very creative when they stop punching each other, Marla. But, I mean, keeping it very active worked well for these guys. The park was designed by Place Design Group. That's Marion with Yasmin, who's one of the people using the park on that day. The park was designed by Place Design Group, and it already works well in an intercultural environment, and I think the lessons of the last decade find expression here. It's an easy place to be in with a big family. It's an easy place to gather with friends. People drive from other suburbs around Potts Hill. These women had driven over from Punchbowl to play with their children. It's a draw card in that sort of way. But Digital Rain positions youth in this space as an integrated part of the design. And you know, again, it doesn't preclude the more iconic work that uses the heritage infrastructure of water. This is Aqua Profunda by Paul Johnson. Also enabling young people to work with the new landscape, the developing project Ripple Edge, where Joanne Sayed is working with Berron Girls High. It explores an intercultural understanding of water. A big part of the site has been the periphery of the site, the new suburb, the periphery, and also the migrant camp that was part of the workforce for Potts Hill, and those things have been explored. Just moving towards the end, I think the capacity of young people as designers and the capacity of young people to design within a landscape context enables a sustained connection to youth environments. At Oran Park Youth Hub, we extended a very comprehensive consultation run by GHD with designers, JMD and Convic to work with the potential of young people as designers. Working to a brief, working with a real-life environment, understanding the design context of their local community and understanding the products that needed to be produced. Working first with seating design with artist Graham Chalcroft, young people are now engaged in the design and form of a detailed arbour structure developed by Anton James as part of this youth environment. Okay, in conclusion, I think the suburbs will continue to be the studio in which intercultural identities are forged. There won't be an end to this. Ephemeral work will interact processes of cultural intervention in sites that reflect both emerging cultural realities and older narratives. And new diversities will emerge, sometimes transient, sometimes gaining purchase, always using place, I think, to their own ends. They're urban shapeshifters in this sense. And I think older diversities will rise like cold cases, demanding acknowledgement and redress. The new urban environment of the new decade, I think, will encapsulate these things in ways that will be exciting for us as professionals. I think of North Parramatta, which we're starting work on now. You know, a site of extraordinary pain. I mean, really, the female factory, Parramatta Girls' Home, Parramatta Jail. I mean, one of the most significant cultural sites in Sydney, and a site where at our meetings the heritage person describes what's happened at the Royal Commission, because that's where her people that, you know, have experience of living in that site are testifying. But on the other hand, I mean, some of Sydney's most exciting firms will be part of the creation of the new environment, and the new environment will be about contemporary Parramatta, diverse, complicated, really engaged with city life and believing that the city can deliver, you know, can deliver a good environment, can deliver excitement. Back to Johan. He did a final work for us on a wall in the ponds, where he said in the mural, "Death is coming, but I still have to walk the dog." So I'll leave you with that thought.